Good afternoon or evening, depending on where you are joining us. Thank you so much for being here for the National Civic League's October webinar, Creating a Civic Learning Environment. My name is Rebecca Trout, and I am the Program Director of the All-America City Awards and Communications here at the National Civic League. For those of you less familiar with the League, we are a 127-year-old nonprofit. We aim to advance civic engagement to create more equitable and thriving places. The All-America City Award is our flagship program, began in 1949 to recognize and celebrate outstanding examples of local civic accomplishments. So we use our annual award program to celebrate those communities, and then we use this webinar series to highlight their promising practices, as well as to share additional tools and resources that could help communities with their engagement efforts. Before we begin, I just want to give a quick shout out to our 2022 All-America City Award winners. You see those 10 winning communities on your screen. We had the pleasure of collaborating with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading this past year. And as such, these 10 communities were recognized for using housing as a platform to improve the prospects for early school success and equitable learning recovery. You can read more about their award-winning work and watch their presentations on our website. And now we are already gearing up for the 2023 awards. We're pivoting to a youth engagement theme. So we're really looking for communities who are focused on youth health and well-being and really involving youth themselves in those priorities and in those projects. We have a non-exhaustive list of projects that you might consider applying under, as well as the important dates here on your screen. We are accepting letters of intent now until December 15th, and then full applications are not due until February 15th of next year. So there's still a lot of time if you're at all interested in applying under this year's theme. I'll also be sending more information and a link to this year's application and your follow-up email to this webinar. So one of the traits that is very common amongst All-America cities are, collaborative culture and civic engagement culture. And we're going to be hearing today from 3 individuals who are really trying to embed this at a very young age and into classrooms. So we'll be hearing first from Dr. Stacy Molnar-Main. Then we will hear from Jennifer Cody, and last but not least, we'll be joined by Diane Stoikovi. So excited for them to share their wealth of experience and resources, and then we'll also have a little bit of discussion and Q&A at the end. A few housekeeping items before I hand it off to their capable hands. We are asking everyone to remain muted to cut down on any background noise and be respectful of our speakers. We will be taking Q&A at the end, but if you could either hold those questions until the end or put them in the chat as you think of them, and we'll get those addressed towards the end of our time together. We are recording this webinar. The recording as well as the slides will be made available to you. And with that, I will hand it off to Stacy. Stacy?
Great, thank you very much, Rebecca. I'm going to try to pull up the slide set so you can let me know when you see it.
Looks great.
Great. All right, well, I want to thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I appreciate the National Civic League's interest in this topic. And for those of you who chose to be here today, I appreciate your interest as well. I'm glad that people are interested in learning more about how educators can embed civic learning into the learning environment to improve outcomes for all students. I'm especially excited because I'm here today with 2 educators that I admire a great deal from my home state of Pennsylvania, Diane Stoikovi, a retired school principal, and Jennifer Cody, a 5th grade teacher. I'm going to provide a brief introduction to an article that was recently published by the National Civic League that you may have access to along with this, this PowerPoint. And this article was really sort of the basis of framing up this conversation today. So I'm going to try and cover some introductory ground about what we learned from teachers who were focused on embedding civic learning into their K-5 classrooms. And then I really want to turn it over to the experts who are the educators. And so you'll hear from Donanne and Jennifer, hopefully a little bit more than you hear from me. So the first thing I want to ask or answer is, why should we care about this issue? I've been studying civic learning for over a decade, and my interest in this topic came directly from my work in elementary and middle schools. I began my career as a school psychologist, which typically is the person that educators call when they're really struggling to figure out how to engage a student in learning. There's some concern, there's some to figure out how to solve that for that student so that they can learn in a setting. And based upon that initial work, I've really had a long-standing interest in understanding not only how educators come to understand themselves as problem solvers, but how young people and students come to see themselves as problem solvers. Whether they're involved in solving problems related to their own learning, whether related to solving problems to the classroom, playground, their school environment, or their own communities. I'm fascinated with understanding what factors in a child's life make them willing to say, I want to be involved. I want to help. I want to find solutions to a problem that affects me, that affects you, that affects us all. This is where civic learning comes in, because civic learning at its root is concerned with how people come to understand their role in society and exercise their capacities as participants in a democracy. So for many years, the common logic that's been supported by research is that civic learning happens in families, it happens in schools, and it happens in the communities in which students participate in. And for many, many years, these communities tended to be face-to-face communities, like religious communities, after-school activities, sports, neighborhoods. These are still places where civic learning happens, but in recent years, the issue of young people's civic learning has been complicated by technology, social media, and national politics. All of these newer factors that are involved in socializing young people are really positioned to exploit divisions in our society, encourage people to gather in like-minded communities, and often discourage personal accountability. So our students are now steeped in new media that may reinforce a self-centeredness, distract them from real life issues, and reinforce narratives that it's us against them. But when I walk down the street and I look around my community, which is in Pennsylvania, I'm from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, I see a community that is thriving in many ways and that's working on really solving the day-to-day problems that affect it. I worry about young people learning to participate in that. And I see our schools as very important places in which we can begin to mediate and continue to mediate students' civic learning. If there's one thing that you remember from this presentation today, I want it to be this. Our children are learning lessons about democracy and civic life, whether we choose to teach those lessons or not. As John Dewey said, example is notoriously more potent than precept. When children are online watching the news or in school, they're learning things about what it means to participate in a community, to live in a democracy, and to solve problems or not. There are subtle and not subtle lessons all around them all the time about what democratic citizenship is. Today, we're focused on schools because our children spend a huge amount of time in schools, up to 6 to 7 hours a day. And it's a wonderful opportunity for us to be really deliberate about thinking about what they're learning civically in those spaces. This question at the top of this slide is really important. Whether you're a teacher, a school board member, a parent, a taxpayer, you should wonder what forms of democratic citizenship are being modeled in the classroom or schools down your street. Research suggests that frequently schools reinforce conceptions of citizenship that focus on well-behaved citizens that follow rules. They help out. Patriotism is also a common trait reinforced by schools, and these things are undeniably important aspects of democratic citizenship, but there are others too that are often neglected. It's also important for democratic citizens to be service-oriented, to care about serving their communities, to be justice-centered, to care about fairness, equality, and justice, to be deliberative, to recognize that many problems have no easy answers, but we should make the best decision possible given the information, resources, and options we have. We also benefit when citizens are creative. That's where innovation starts. And of course, we should be increasingly concerned about preparing students to be citizens in an increasingly global world. The point of this slide is this: our democracy and our communities are strengthened when participants recognize and play a myriad of roles for the benefit of all. While it may be easiest for schools to focus on well-behaved citizenship and not complicate notions of patriotism, we benefit when notions of justice, creativity, and service are entered into our conceptions of citizenship and how we practice citizenship every day. So that was a question that I wanted to ask. How is the day-to-day work of educators teaching citizenship? And we chose to focus on the learning environment, the social, physical, psychological, and pedagogical contexts in which learning occurs and which affects student achievement and attitudes. The learning environment is more than just the content of learning. It has to do with the routines, the practices, and the norms that students experience when they're learning. We know from research that the learning environment impacts students in a variety of ways. Students' relationship to their learning environment affects whether they feel they're capable, whether they feel they're connected, whether they feel they can contribute, and whether they feel they belong. It's not just content, it's about how we work together. Research on the learning environment suggests that open classroom climates have the capacity to impact civic learning in particular. I'm going to read to you the definition of an open classroom climate, which is a school or classroom context where students are encouraged to bring up relevant issues in class, express their opinions, explore perspectives that may be different from their own without fear of judgment. Research demonstrates that when it comes to future civic behavior of students, the way that the teacher engages with students and allows students' interests and perspectives to come into the classroom matters. The environment in which they create in the classroom matters. Students who experience an open classroom climate demonstrate increased civic knowledge, greater participation in school, more positive attitudes about future political engagement, about whether they expect that they'll be informed citizens, voting citizens, involved in their community. But there's a paradox with an open classroom climate, and that is when you invite students to bring in issues of concern, there's the potential that they'll bring in issues that are controversial or challenging. So we're going to talk today a little bit about how the teachers who have joined us today deal with that paradox, but importantly, shine the light on the nuts and bolts of doing this work. So the research that I referred to was conducted through research exchanges supported by the Kettering Foundation. The Kettering Foundation is a research foundation that focuses on research on understanding how to make democracy stronger. The exchanges began with US secondary teachers, included international teachers, and ended up focusing on US elementary teachers. And the questions that we wanted to focus on were, what are the skills and dispositions students need to become deliberative citizens? Those are those citizens who can grapple with issues, complex issues together when there are trade-offs in order to come to some decision. We were also interested in what types of routines and practices support this type of learning. And we partnered with teachers and engaged them in some reflection and learning, and then sent them back to their classrooms to experiment with teaching civic learning in their classroom with a focus on deliberative citizenship. When they reconvened a year later, we asked them an important question. The first was, what are the building blocks of deliberative democratic citizenship? They identified 6 building blocks. The first were communication skills, empathic perspectives taking, student agency, sense of belonging to a democratic community, the skills of deliberative decision-making, and awareness of other things that support a strong democracy. Some of the assumptions that we had about deliberative citizenship are that diversity is an inherent and generative feature of democracy. Citizens have a role to play in public decision-making because addressing public issues typically requires something of citizens. Trade-offs, as I said, are inherent to any decision and must be grappled with in order to arrive at a good decision. There are more than 2 ways of understanding and solving most problems. That is, there are more than the 2 ways that maybe political parties suggest. It is important for citizens and their representatives to justify their decisions to each other in a public process as free and equal persons seeking fair terms of cooperation rather than as simply subjects to be controlled. And although deliberation is something that individuals may do naturally, in order to engage in deliberation with others, it takes some practice. So again, the 6 building blocks that the teachers identified are here. And then we asked, what are the features of the learning environment that support civic learning? And it looks like something is missing from this slide set that I downloaded, Rebecca. The first bubble should say visible democratic norms. There it is, it showed up. The types of things that the teachers identified as reflecting visible democratic norms were some student-informed rules or guidelines that were posted in the room, that were revisited and reflected on, that were integrated into academic routines. They also included routines of civic care, which included relationship building activities, social emotional learning activities integrated into the classroom meetings, and service to the class or community. This included things like classroom jobs. Diverse narratives were another feature of the learning environment. And you'll see examples there: classroom literature, student biographies, oral history, history as choice. You'll hear some examples of this from our educators. And then finally, choice and voice were a big piece of these classrooms. Choice in academics, voice in class and school-wide decisions, and activities that allowed creative and personal expression. So these are the themes that emerged from educators that were working to engage in civic learning, not using a particular curriculum, but just as a focus in the context of their classroom. These were K-5 teachers, and so today we have a K-5 principal and a 5th grade teacher who are going to give you a little more detail about what this looks like in practice. And I'm going to now turn it over. Let's see. Jennifer's going to take control. Thanks, Jennifer.
Sure, I'm gonna allow Dawn-Ann to control my slides because the school district decided that now is the time to do repair on our network. So I'm hotspotting and I don't want you to lose the slides. So Dawn-Ann's gonna share for me. Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Cody. I am a 5th grade teacher in Central Pennsylvania. I've been teaching 5th grade for the last 16 years. It's the only grade I've ever taught. Way back in 2007, when I started, I was kind of just floundering, teaching the subjects, getting my feet wet. By the end of that school year, I started to feel a pull towards curricular integration. in an attempt to better engage my students in the work that we were doing in the classroom. And although democratic teaching and learning is the centerpiece of the work that I try to do every day, yeah, it was not always the case, though I had good intentions. As I started down the path of curricular integration and centering our work on current local issues, democracy was not a focus of mine. I simply wanted them to engage with notions of problems in their backyards, which essentially is part of democratic teaching. And I, after a few more years, started to develop a year-long cross-curricular interdisciplinary unit that was centered on science and water quality issues. And I was using a fake town and a fake problem to do the work. And the students were really excited to work towards solving the problem for this town that I worked really hard to pretend was real. And I was really taken aback by their level of engagement. And I was excited to pass that on to my colleagues and to share my learning with other people. And moving forward in a couple of slides, I'm going to share 2 year-long projects that I've done in my classroom. But first, I'd like to talk about establishing classroom learning environment, which I believe to be incredibly critical in order to do the work that I'm going to speak about. I think that it's necessary to foster community building and bonding among all the members in my classroom community, our paraprofessionals, student teachers, the students. Beginning from the first day of school, we begin to address many of the questions that you'll see posted there on my journal page. They're just sticky notes of questions that I've wondered about with my students, because I often like to do my own inquiries, and I like to know, what do my students care about? What do they talk about at dinner with their families? Who do they look up to? Is there anything that they would protest about or march for? And essentially, in my mind, this is identity work and me asking the students to think about who they are as humans, what's their place in the world, and what do they stand for? So that work is long. It takes no less than 6 weeks, I feel, to build a foundation that will allow us to do the work that I'm going to speak about. Another important part of my classroom learning environment are essential questions that I pose for the students that are continuously revisited as the year goes on. The study that we're doing in my classroom this year is a study of what's happening here. So essentially, what's going on where you live, what's happening in your backyard. With my friend Mark, who I'll talk about in a second, we talk about how do we define patriotism, and we'll eventually get to how do you define patriotism? How does our country define patriotism? What is patriotism? I also asked the students at the beginning of the year, as we start to dive into inquiry thinking, why do we say the Pledge of Allegiance? Because that is a question that really stuns them, because they've never really stopped to think about that in these 6 years of schooling. That's really fun to do a close reading of the words and really think about how that lends itself to our definition of patriotism. So I'd like to transition to talking about my first year-long integrated study. If you're interested in learning more about it, you can find it in this place-based education issue of the Green Teacher magazine. There's also a digital version available online. This was a really wonderful representation of mine and Mark's and our friend John's reflection on this process with my students. So the very first time that I did this truly local issue, I was approached by Mark Kissling, who's a social studies education professor at Penn State. And he's a very thoughtful, wonderful place-based educator, and he heard that I had been doing this curriculum study with my students around the fictitious town and problem. And he kind of said, hey, there's this thing happening in our town. I'm wondering if you'd be interested in diving in with your students. He had amassed a file of newspaper articles about the issue. He was really well versed. He helped me get up to speed about the issue, and it felt like a perfect fit. So while I was still teaching all of the curriculum and doing all of the things I was supposed to do, we found a way to make it really relevant to our students. I was very happy to get rid of the fake town, fake issue. During our investigation, we considered whether or not Ferguson Township, which is one of our local townships, should let Toll Brothers move in and build luxury student housing a mile uphill from our town's drinking water aquifer. Because we study water quality in depth in 5th grade, we study land usage, we study how water flows, we study water rights. All of that was considered in this work. We read a lot of newspaper articles, we read poetry, we read a chapter book, did a lot of multi-genre writing. We wrote narrative stories about what was happening, informational stories that had to do with the water quality and all of the different pieces embedded in the problem. One of the greatest aspects of this study was inviting in experts from our community to speak to the students. We invited 2 board representatives from the Ferguson Township Board of Supervisors with differing positions on the issue. They came in and spoke to the students and shared their thoughts. They included other perspectives other than their own, so that the students could see adults in this capacity modeling the notion that there are many positions for this. We also brought in a hydrogeologist that did all of the study of the land, of the rock, the aquifer, shared the testing that they did. Catabus, our local bus service, had something to say about this development. We had a pretty comprehensive, we amassed a lot of evidence and data for our students to make informed decisions to answer this essential question: should Ferguson Township let Toll Brothers move in? And I kept what I call an evidence board, and students often changed their thoughts about that question based on new evidence that they were amassing. And some of them would switch out of the group they were working in because they really appreciated the perspective of another group. And they were thoroughly using evidence to back up their thinking. Another wonderful aspect of this work was students were going home and talking to their families about what was happening in their backyard and talking about the development, sharing with their parents all of the new information that they were gathering. Parents were coming back and sharing how excited they were that their kids went home from school and talked about school and told them information about what we were doing in the classroom. And they began to have very strong feelings about what was happening. When we wrote letters to the editor as a part of our persuasive writing unit, one of my student letters was chosen to be published. We had students going to the Board of Supervisors meetings so that they could be up to date in real time and listen to what the people had to say. The meetings, community members, and the board members. So I did that work with Mark a few years before the pandemic happened, and the 2 years of the pandemic were kind of tough. I had a little bit of a hard time wrapping my mind around the magnitude of this work while trying to keep my head above water. So I'm finally coming back around to thinking about what's happening in our backyard again, and the idea of posing real issues for my students. And we're doing it this year by having them read the newspaper and search for issues that are local to our county, city, or townships, and things that resonate with them. They're cutting out of the newspaper and they're posting on the bulletin board in our classroom. and the articles surround a map of our townships, and they're making connections to the places on the map where the newspaper articles are occurring. My hope as they read the newspaper every day, they're following different stories that have resonated with them. And I expect to take this to action as the year goes on, as I'm watching and listening to the students talk about some of these things that are really troubling them. Let's see. This is also a year-long interdisciplinary cross-curricular unit where students are reading the newspaper, they're reading other articles on the internet from other news sources that are highlighting some of the articles that they're focusing on. And I'd love to talk about for a minute about some things that have worked really well in this area and things that have caught me off guard a little. Some things, like I said, that have happened include students actually educating their parents about issues and having ongoing dialogue and in the car and at dinner. The integrative investigations provided students with information that allowed them to communicate effectively with local officials and the scientists that came into our classroom and other community members. I also think that my work with parents in explicitly sharing what's going to be happening in our classroom has been really helpful. Things that have caught me off guard, I expected initial easy replication of the work from year to year of my own work, and that hasn't been the case. I found it incredibly difficult to just jump in with what I already knew to be true with a new group of students. While the issue may have stayed the same and carried over from one class to another, their engagement, their life experiences, and all kinds of contextual factors caused me to take some steps back and reevaluate and shift my thinking a little. Also, I have found that I need to avoid fast media with 10-year-olds because that's such as YouTube, other video applications, video things that they'll see on the internet, because especially right now, they're being inundated with political ads as they're trying to do research and watch information about the things that we're studying. So I shifted to slow media and newspapers so that I could at least pre-read and see what they're going to be looking at before they're actually looking at it. When I initially started this work, parents didn't have anything to say because fake town, fake issue. But as soon as I started to share with my next group of students that we were focusing on a local issue, at back to school night, one of the parents that I was excitedly explaining this to said, "What's your stance? Like, what are your thoughts about this?" And I wasn't sure exactly if the parent was saying, like, what are your thoughts? Because they too had thoughts, or if they were like, are you going to be bringing politics and political divisiveness into the classroom with this issue? And I was careful, and I'm always careful, to work really hard to establish a nonpartisan classroom identity. Of course, I have thoughts and opinions about these issues. Of course I do, but my goal is not to push an agenda on my students. My goal is to share as many perspectives as possible so as not to create an artificial binary and have them think about what other evidence do we need? Who's missing from this table? Who are all of the stakeholders? What are the benefits and trade-offs of this issue? How can we get to the root of it all before we make decisions about what should and shouldn't happen? I think it's very important for teachers to consider their own political knowledge when wanting to teach about a local issue. I think it's important to have a depth of understanding of what's happening around it, who are all the people involved, what are all the benefits and trade-offs. I think without that information, it's really easy to get caught in a trap of what's your stance with no real answer in the moment. And I think it's also really important to share ahead of time if you're going to do this kind of work that's centered on what could be considered a divisive issue, that you share upfront in depth ahead of time with parents. Here's an issue that we're going to investigate. Here's how it's happening. Here's how I'm integrating the content. Yes, I am still teaching all of the standards, but I am also having students think in a really critical way about things that matter in their lives. And with that kind of proactive approach, I have found parents do not come at me with, what's your stance? They just say, wow, that sounds like a lot of work. Can't wait to hear what my students learn about this. As far as suggestions, as I said, start local and be politically aware. I think it's important to know your learner population and who the families are, hence the extremely long community building time that I allow before I start this work. Proactive family engagement. And one of the most important things that I found to be beneficial is administrator and collegial support. When an administrator sees value and purpose in the work that you're doing and they're on board with it and willing to stand behind you and stand next to you, it speaks volumes for everyone. When they show so much trust and pushing students in a way that allows to engage in things that matter in their lives, it's really powerful and really important. And I think that it's important to acknowledge our next speaker, Donnie, was my administrator for my first 9 years of teaching, and she was incredible. I learned all of these things from her. She was my mentor. She was like a dream administrator, and she has been gone for the last 6 years, and things have changed. I've had principals in that time. They question, what's happening here? What are you doing? How is this relevant to the curriculum? They ask a lot of questions. And for the most part, they are fine with what I'm doing because I can speak to it and I can tie it to standards and I can talk about student achievement and how we're performing and all of the things, but I cannot say enough about administrative support. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Donnie and Sophie so that she can talk about whole school democracy.
Thank you, Jen. Before I get started with the keys to leading a democratic school, I'd like to talk a little bit about my grounding. And I've been grounded in the work of John Goodlad, as well as Dewey and some of the others that were into democracy. But Goodlad comes most to me because there are several things that he believed were important. First of all, in a school community, you must have all materials and human resources to become places of learning and joy. And you obviously can see that in the things that Jen has done. It's also important to generate in all communities a comprehensive conversation about what schools are for and how we help them to do it. What kind of people do we want our children to be? And I'll talk a little bit more about that as I talk about conversations with parents, as well as with teachers, as well as with the children themselves. And then Goodlad also talked about 4 moral dimensions of schools. And one of them was the enculturation into a political and social democracy in a school. And later I'm going to share the story of the Salad Girls and their plunge into learning about the school system and how to engage within the system and how to make change for the better as a common good. And then also equitable access to knowledge and ensure skills and knowledge. And obviously with good teachers like Jen, that's really a given in a school like Park Forest. And then nurturing pedagogy creates a stimulating classroom. And clearly that's present in a classroom that you've heard from Jen, where students think differently about problems and they try to look for alternative solutions to things. And finally, teachers and principals are responsible for being the stewards of the school, that they're responsible for the climate, which Stacy talked a lot about, and they encourage inquiry and reflection, which I'll talk a little bit more about inquiry. And then they also help to make change and help it be a powerful unit, the school be a powerful unit of change. So my perspective as a leader is that I'm the lead learner in a school. I'm not just the principal of the school or administrator of the school. I'm learning along with, and I'm the leader of learning, and I want the teachers to be the lead learner in their classroom. Secondly, I want them to I want to have professional learning all the time. John Goodlad talked about simultaneous renewal, and that's very important as you're working with teachers.
Dawn-Ann,
inquiry.
So sorry to interrupt you. I'm sharing your slides and I'm just not quite sure if you want to share your own slides. I just don't know if I'm on the right one or not. If you could just
I'm still on the keys. I'm still on the keys to leading a democratic school.
Okay, just guide me and please let me know when to change slides.
Oh, okay. So I don't need to, okay. And then there's positive relationships, teachers and families and students. All those relationships are happening. Support and mentoring, voice and choice are important, and respect and trust have to be embedded in a school in order for it to become a democratic school. So next. Can you see my screen or no?
No, we're on my screen. If you'd like to start sharing your screen, you can.
Okay. Now I'll let you go ahead. So conversations as inquiry is a process that I've used with teachers, and then eventually we used with students. One of our prime ones was the lunchroom dilemma. We took a futures protocol and we did it with the teachers and the parents and the children, and also the lunch professionals. We had a mess in the lunchroom. And so we wanted to straighten it out so that everybody felt respect. Other protocols, and these come from either the National School Reform Faculty or the School Reform Initiative. And so these are very helpful as you're working with teachers to help them embed inquiry in what you do in your conversations with teachers, as well as conversations with students, as well as other conversations when you're looking at student work. Okay, next slide. So in partnerships with families, Goodlad talked about how important it is to engage families in conversations about what is democracy, why is it important for a school, what are ground rules that you need, talking about wishes, hopes, and dreams for all. What kinds of people do we want our students to become? This was really an important aspect to do with parents, because parents often think that the academics are the strongest piece of what they have to have in a school. When you start to talk about what kind of people do you want your children to become, academics typically aren't the main feature of the kind of people that you want them to become. We did things at our school like having town hall meetings. We had kids meet in multi-age groups so that they could respect one another. And we also spent time writing a school constitution. We shared with parents about school assessments and how important, what level of importance they are, and that the person that was most important for understanding their child was the teacher in the classroom and how they assess their children on a daily basis. We also talked with parents about what school testing, what the state testing is, and what you needed to do if you wanted to opt out of it. Next. So one of the key things in teaching teachers about learning with kids, as far as getting kids involved in participating, was something called Roger Hart's ladder of participation. And this is also another thing that's at the core of what I believe, that the bottom 3 rungs are ones that do happen, but they aren't really where you want to. They're more adult-led activities, but which children really have minimal input into. And then the top ones, and they aren't really in any order. You can be in level rung 8, rung 5, any of those are fine, but you're engaging kids so that they have voice and choice in what you do. And this is one of the pieces that I used with teaching teachers how to think about activities that they were doing. And I found one of the things that was easiest to do, not necessarily easy, but we were a school that did a lot of community service, but moving it to a school that engaged in service learning. So next slide. So, oops, sorry. I'm going to move ahead to planning principles of service learning. So everything, the importance when you shift between community service to service learning, there's the academic integrity into it. If you just collect coats and give them to the coat bank, that's a wonderful feel-good thing that happens for maybe 2 weeks during a school year, and that's it. If you're doing academic integrity, if you're doing a service learning project, you're spending a lot more time. Students own the project. They're looking at how something that they see it as a problem and how can we help it? And then what the academic pieces are. There's a lot of teacher facilitation. I know Jen looks across all the standards, figures out what are the important pieces. And then most of all, it's apprentice citizenship. It gives kids the opportunity to go back to those core elements that Stacy talked about, the belonging, the authenticity, and then civic awareness and what kind of expertise. Next slide. So Stacy mentioned the Kettering Foundation. There are several different historic simulations that we've used in the school. A New Land is one about after we established ourselves as a country, then there were the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, and how do we govern it? Everybody had different money, different things. The one that I worked with one of our other colleagues, Lori, and did these in her classroom. And the one that we really enjoyed doing was 1776. We wrote an article for social studies in the young learner, and it was on deliberations and democracy. That's also accessible online if you're interested in it. There's pictures, a picture here of the kids working. They each took a group. One was to be a diplomat, one was to rebel, and one was to stay with the king. And interestingly enough, 3 of the years that I did it with Lori, each year the kids picked a different stance in it. So we had some that didn't want to leave the king. But what was the neatest connection was when we were talking about, there was a divisive issue going on in our school community, in the community at large. And it was about building a high school. And the kids immediately connected it to what was happening with that and believed that parents should get involved in some deliberative democracy conversation. So next slide. So some other inquiries that I've done, and these with the support of the teachers, and I mentioned earlier the lunchroom dilemma, which was really mine because I had a parent come to me and say, my daughter's not eating her lunch. She buys the lunch that her friends buy, and then she throws her lunch away. And so I started eating in the lunchroom with kids and talking to them. And then we eventually figured out how we could change the lunchroom space so that it was good for everybody and they could have the meal they wanted, not the one they had to get because their friend was getting it. The kids wrote to me about adding recess time. In the end, the school district changed the elementary day, so that one got taken care of. We were a zero waste school. This was something that I worked with Mark on and also did some writing with him on it. And we really focused, we wanted to attain zero waste. students came to me with the question of, is it really possible for us to get to zero waste? And as I share here, 87% of our school waste managed to be diverted from the landfill. And that included composting. It was truly a community effort. We also did some things with our schoolyard that we had gardens and on-site wetlands, and we had Boy Scout and Girl Scout projects that happened on our school site. And then we also did some, we had a Pennsylvania Department of Ed grant over a 3-year period to work on having kids with special needs become members, participants, and then move to learning. And so these were powerful opportunities of inquiry. So, and then the last slide, or the next slide. So Salad Girls, which I talked about earlier, really was an opportunity for a whole lunch change. So the kids came back from lunch. There were 6 girls that had various dietary needs, and they wanted salads, but the salads weren't meeting their needs. One was a Muslim, and so she couldn't have meat. There was a child who was lactose intolerant, and so the cheese wasn't good for her. There was some that were gluten-free, and there were others that supported, some of that had various things. So they came to Jen and they asked her, what can we do about this? Can we picket? Can we protest? Can we put a letter together and have the school change it? And so one of the questions so Jen had the kids come and talk to me. And so I said, first of all, what's your question? And then so their question really was, how can we change lunch so it satisfies the needs of all? Now, their vision of what they wanted was kind of a salad bar, but what they had to do was go through some actions and be ready to present to the school food service people. So along with Jen and some other colleagues, they worked on creating a survey. They went around and surveyed all the classrooms. They analyzed that data, and then they got a presentation ready to share with the whole school, as well as the food service people. And so they met with the food service person from our school. They shared the data and asked about changes. And she said, I really understand where you're coming from, but I'm not the one that can make the changes. But the step I wanted them to know is you don't jump over. You have to take all the people in this position that they are. So after that, then we met with the food service person. They shared the data and processed so far, and then they wanted to make changes. And she offered to make changes to the salad offerings, which affected the whole elementary school district. She explained to them that they couldn't do a salad bar because that really was not allowed at the elementary level to fit in with food service programs. But what she could do is offer 4 different lunches, a salad without meat, a salad without cheese, salad without croutons, and a salad with everything. So she implemented that within a short amount of time. And first of all, the girls were kind of disappointed because they really wanted to be able to pick up what they wanted. But then they realized that they had made a change, and it was a powerful change for the school. And so next slide.
So Dawn-Ann, I'm just going to interrupt us for a second. Rebecca, how much time do we have? Because I do want to allow options for at least one question. Are we ending at 6?
Yes, I can stay over a little longer if people want to hang on, but we are scheduled to end at 6.
Okay, so Dawn-Ann, if you could just wrap up in 30 seconds or so, and hopefully we'll at least be able to answer a question or two before we have to wrap up.
Okay, so next slide, the things that worked and what didn't. I think these are important. Students are able to engage in the school, in the community, whether it's the school, the larger community, their classroom community. They learn how academics are connected to their community. They become active, engaged students because there's meaning to their learning. And then the reality check that I had to constantly remind myself is you're never going to get 100% of people on board with everything. Even if you hold their hands through the process, they're still not going to get on board. And the democracy is messy. You can in the lunchroom dilemma, we wanted to have kids work on the rules. And one of the teachers said to another teacher, why doesn't she just tell them what the rules should be? Well, that defeats the whole purpose. And so democracy, voice, and choice take a lot of time and a lot of patience. And so those are the things that I learned out of working with my school community and working with kids and working with teachers. So thanks.
Great, thank you all so much. That was a robust overview of everything that you all have been doing. I appreciate you sharing. I now want to invite my colleague, Mike McGrath, who is the editor of the National Civic Review. He had a couple of questions for our presenters. So if you want to stay on for that, we'll have them here. And if not, this is being recorded. Understand that we've gone a little over time, so if you have to leave, we understand. Mike, the floor is yours. And you're on mute.
Yeah, Stacy's article in the National Civic Review was part of the summer issue, which I posted the URL to, of the National Civic Review, with a number of different articles on civic education. And we're interested in getting feedback on these. Either, you can do it in the chat, or maybe you can follow up with an email to me. It's part of a collaboration with the Kettering Foundation, which have been mentioned several times in this presentation. So I'll just open it up to any questions that people have to the presenters at this point.
Great. Thanks, Mike. If you have a question, you can use the raise hand feature and unmute yourself to ask directly to the panelists, or feel free to put that question in the chat as well.
And I want to just let folks know, Betty Knighton is here. She's from the National Issues Forums Institute. I noticed her, and I may know some other people. Betty her organization does publish the historic decision resources that Diane referenced, and I posted some information link in the chat if you'd like to access those. Those are a nice way to bring kids into issues, public issues, but from a historic standpoint.
All right, any questions? Going once, going twice? All right, well, thank you all for being on with us this afternoon/evening. I appreciate your time. Especially want to thank Diane, Stacy, and Jennifer for your time and preparation, putting this together and being with us here this afternoon. Really appreciate it, and all the great work that you've done in your classrooms and in your schools over the years. As I mentioned at the top of the hour, we did record today's webinar, and we will be sending the webinar as well as some follow-up resources and slides and an email. Those will probably come to you tomorrow afternoon. And with that, I'll let everyone go. Thank you all so much.